So, what did Malthus develop in 1798, Natasha?
Well, he had the theory of population and related to food source. He did take the revolution into account. As soon as population gets to a certain point, it will come crashing down.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of restart again.
Why would the population come crashing down?
Because there's not enough food for population.
So what he did was he mapped out population growth and food supply. And he found out this relationship that population growth versus food supply increase differently. Food supply increases linearly, which means what? Okay, but increases, so it's not going to go straight across. Population growth increases exponentially. What does that mean? Exactly, awesome. So if this is population here, and this is food supply here, at some point, the population is going to exceed the food supply that is required to support it.
Are you recording right now?
Pardon?
Are you recording right now?
Yes.
Okay, then never mind.
Pretty sure I'm recording. Yes, I am.
Okay, I was gonna say what happened. No, I was gonna make a dumb joke. It's okay.
No, it's okay. What happens when?
Okay, what if the population was rising and the increase of farmers is also drastically rising because of these people?
What do you think will happen?
Well, it depends.
There's not enough land.
Keep going.
Okay, well, they could technically go side by side, then they could both go up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it would have to depend, because you'd have to do there's a certain area because you wouldn't be able to go over the entire planet.
So in the last 40 years, what two aspects have profoundly changed the agricultural industry to try to keep pace with the increasing population?
Yeah, machinery.
Genetic modification is one.
Oh yeah, true now. Because,
Do you know what I mean when I say genetic modification?
yeah, higher yielding
Like,
crops.
they made a big batch of salmon that was increased meat and less organs. And
Yes.
stuff. And
A
they grow
bird
faster.
looking at inserting the gene from a cold water fish that makes almost like an antifreeze in its body to survive in cold water places, and putting that into something like wheat, so that maybe we can prolong the wheat growing season just a little bit more, which means it might grow more kernels or larger kernels. We genetically modify crops to resist pests. So, for example, Roundup Ready canola is used in relationship to a herbicide called Roundup Ready. The gene allows the plant to break down the Roundup Ready so it doesn't kill the plant, but that Roundup Ready will kill everything else that's growing around it. We also see something called the BT7 corn, and I believe there's a couple strains of tomato which have been developed to try to withstand a pest. So that's one. We know that we've had to change the way our food is microscopically to try to get more of it to meet our growing population. Second thing in the 1970s. Machinery
Auto farms.
and the use of
That's not even fertilizer.
fertilizer.
So
Now, the process used to create fertilizer, known as the Haber-Bosch process, was actually created in the late 1900s. But it took a while to get that on a mass production scale and get that into the breadbasket areas of Canada, which we're actually located in. It's pretty cool to go over to Italy and see wheat-based products that are made of wheat farmed in Humboldt. Well, those things have tried, to solve this problem. However, many biologists fear that we have suppressed this and we are artificially keeping our population elevated. And if something happens to our agricultural crops, we will face a crisis because we will not be able to feed everyone. So Thomas Malthus came up with this idea that if there's more organisms than what the environment can support, you're going to have competition for resources. In this case, he was very specific about food competition. So he's going to go on our timeline here. 1798 and Malthus. Then we get into 1809, which is Lamarck.
Which one? We do this. Oh, you have. Okay.
All right, this is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck.
Maybe go to one.
If you take a look at his style of dress and his name, what country is he from? France. Absolutely. A very curious person here. So in a nutshell, Brittany, what did Lamarck's theory say?
Basically he said that with animals, the traits they got over time were things they, like for example with the giraffe, he says it's in the beginning had a short neck, and then over time, because the environment kept changing, the animals changed with it, and whatever changes they got embedded in their DNA and genes, and that their offspring didn't have to go through what they went through, they just automatically got it. And then he also said that whatever trace animals had that they didn't use would over time eventually just disappear and be lost.
So imagine if you could have children that already had a grade 12 education.
Well,
Because that's basically what he's saying, right? You are learning over your lifetime. So theoretically, according to what he said here, your children should be born with those traits.
Not learning and not adapting. Like, say, if I were to live, I don't know, like in water. Like, if I were to spend my life in water, and if I were to have a family and they were to spend their lives in water, that would be like an environmental factor, not a way of thinking.
And that's kind of what he's pointing out here. He calls these acquired characteristics. These things are things that develop over your lifetime. So, for example, if I am sipping my coffee every day, I will build up arm muscles, and my children will have stronger right arms because I've been spending my lifetime drinking coffee with this arm. What can you see as being some issues with this theory?
His theory was miscommunicated and misunderstood lots.
So one thing that doesn't work about this.
And it has no, like, diversity at all. So if you live in those, I think to adapt into a specific environment, like change would happen.
Oh, very interesting, yes. We see that with the panda bear too, very, very specialized. And it's under such pressure to survive, then why does it stay the way it does in terms of its eating habits?
Well, and why would they need to
that
change?
food only, so that if you changed it,
The key issue with Lamarck's theory is how does the offspring inherit that characteristic? So, going back to I'm lifting up my cup of coffee, right? My arm muscle's getting bigger. Alright, Lamarck, how does a bigger arm muscle get transmitted to my child? So, Lamarck did some awesome things. He had this idea of how things develop in their lifetime. Yep, they thought he was a little bit off his rocker, so to speak, especially since at this point in time, the church was still an important, very important authority figure. So to say that something naturally happened for organisms to develop went against the teachings of the church. So, the key thing for Lamarck is the inheritance of acquired characteristics and his principle of use and disuse. If you don't use it, you lose it, is basically what he said. Interestingly, even though we don't really hold to his theory, we still talk about evolution in Lamarckian terms. For example, I will have people say to me that a polar bear has adapted to its environment because it has a white coat. That implies, from a Lamarckian point of view, that the polar bear was born without a white coat, and somehow it changed the color of its coat over its lifetime, and that allows the parent to pass it on to the next generation.
What about like coyotes and stuff? How their pelts are different colors depending on their surroundings.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing
you.
you.
You know how some coyotes have different colored fur?
Yes.
Their surroundings, would that be an example of that? Because their coats do change.
But was the animal born with that? Or did it develop it over its lifetime?
But I'm just saying that, like, the parents, like, one coyote would have a completely different coat than the one way out the other side of the forest, maybe even, because the surroundings are different.
Yes.
So then over time, do you think that their coats would have adapted more?
Oh, that is a really good characteristic, or a really good question. So my question then is the animal adapting to the environment, or is a particular organism surviving and reproducing? So let's say you have a newborn purple panda that is able to be camouflaged really, really well in the forest and escapes being hunted, and it survives to have children, and thereby able to pass on its purple fur gene to the next generation. That's not Lamarckian evolution. That's starting to get into Darwin, right? Lamarck would have said something like, the panda bear started off being black and white, and over its lifetime started to change color, passed that on to its children, and maybe its children changed more color. They pass that on to their children. So you have successive generations of change in response to the environment. It's interesting to consider. Let's jump to the 1840s. Louis Pasteur discredited something called the theory of spontaneous generation. Have you heard that? Give you a hint, you've probably seen a word with his name in it. What does it mean to pasteurize?
Thin down. Not thin down, like dilute. Or just like
Pasteurization is when you heat up milk to kill the bacteria or whatever, and it does stuff to it.
Mhm. Which means that if you then take that milk and sell it to somebody else, you decrease the likelihood that there could be bacteria in there that would possibly make somebody sick. So it's a process of treating the milk, sterilizing the milk, to try to reduce the risk. So up until this point in time, people believed in what was called the theory of spontaneous generation, which meant that the table is fine today, but if I came back in a month where I just smeared my lovely dirty hand, I would now have germs that took over or something like that. So the theory of spontaneous generation was that life could come from nowhere spontaneously. And so what he did was many experiments. So for example, he took a vessel and he cleaned it. Then he exposed it to very nice environmental conditions, and lo and behold, nothing grew in there. He tried the same thing with using steam. And he found out that there were environments that made it very inhospitable for life. And he also showed that if we have something growing, for example, in the Tupperware container in your locker, that's because it came from something. It didn't just happen to be. So Louis Pasteur discredited spontaneous generation. And showed that in order to get life, you need life, basically. Kind of like the cell theory. Remember we talked about how in order to get a new cell, it had to come from pre-existing cells. He was also the one that came up with what we refer to as the germ theory. So illnesses could be caused by microscopic organisms that we can't see. Up until this point, most people didn't go to the hospital when they were sick. Hospices and sanatoriums were places to avoid. It wasn't until the germ theory came to be that medical science got a lot more recognition by the public, and people started to seek out doctors for medical treatment. We're going to zoom on to 1856, Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace. So tell us about Alfred Wallace, Billy.
Well, Alfred Wallace was a British naturalist, geographer, and social critic. He became a public figure in England during the second half of the 19th century, known for his creative views on scientific, social, and scientific subjects. So he wasn't just a scientist, he was a philosopher, and he did basically everything. And his idea is almost exactly like Darwin's. Like they even, I think, co-wrote a bunch of stuff together, so I couldn't find anything distinct.
So why did Darwin get the credit for natural selection and Wallace did not? Because Wallace came out with his work a couple of years before Charles Darwin did.
Because Darwin stole
No, yeah, because Darwin published it first because he realized that other people were coming up with similar theories.
And he had the work to support
He
it.
had the evidence because he ate everything.
Charles Darwin generated a phenomenal amount of data to back up his theory of natural selection. Wallace simply did not have the support for the theory of natural selection. And by support, I mean the data, but also from the scientific world. At this point in time, Charles Darwin is the rock star of the science world. Wallace is not.
Wallace is
Okay, he also did some work on biogeography, which looked at the distribution of animals around the world. So 1856, this is Alfred Wallace here. Wallace was really before his time. His thinking was just a little bit too revolutionary, and he did not have the visuals necessary to say why he thought that way. So, for example, when we look at biogeography and the distribution of animals throughout the world, it wasn't until 1912 that we had the mechanism to explain that, which was the theory of continental drift. Charles Darwin.
I think I have a shirt too.
All right. And is this on here? All right. Okay. This is the person that is credited with.
Natural selection.
Explain.
Okay, so natural selection is survival of the fittest, where the animals that can adapt and won't survive. So, polar bear. Yeah, because it's adapted in some way to survive to this point. It's alive today, grow up. Okay, so he has the four main points of his theory. More individuals are produced in each generation that can survive, which is what Ms. Patrick was talking about, how they slowly over time will pass on the survival.
So who actually came up with that first point? Was it actually Charles Darwin that talked about population and food competition? No. That first point of Darwin's theory actually draws from the work of Malthus. Okay, second one says what?
Phenotypic variation exists among individuals and the variation is heritable, which means that it'll pass on through generations.
Keyword right here, heritable.
Yeah. Sorry if that was too.
That is the most important point. Number 3?
Those individuals with these traits better suited to their environment will survive. Yeah, he's just.
Not actually something that Darwin said. Number 4.
And when reproductive isolation occurs, new species will form. So when these traits actually do come into play and new species.
Oh. So Darwin's ideas are not necessarily uniquely his. What he was able to do, though, was to unite all these different ideas together and use evidence from his journey to...
Oh, which? What do you mean?
Where did he go?
He traveled the globe.
Yes, he did. He went on a transatlantic adventure all the way down underneath the coast of South America to the famous set of islands Galapagos Islands,
How do you know that?
where he studied what type of animal?
Did he study birds?
Finches. And what he noticed about finches was they had different beaks. And so he suggested that those different beaks allowed the different birds to eat different things and be able to survive on this small set of islands. So he was able to actually combine. Are you revising your work as I talk? He was able to unite these different ideas because he had the diagrams, the pictures, etc. to show people. And science is showing is telling.
And he determined a lot of facts by eating his subjects too.
Pardon?
He ate a lot of his work too.
Yes.
Like, he almost, like, the only beetle he really didn't get to taste was the one that ran away from him. That was actually a poisonous beetle.
There is a story in the biology world of how once upon a time when Charles Darwin was a child, and he was exploring the forest and he found all these bugs, and he really wanted to identify and sketch these bugs, but he ran out of room in his pockets to stash bugs and started putting them in his mouth and walk around with living things squirming around inside his mouth. So this is 1859. The mid-1800s is really a time of the naturalists. A lot of exploration of the natural world. We have the advent of taxonomy in the late 1700s. So a lot of scientists are trying to make their name by finding things first. Because when you find something first, you get to name it, and therefore your place in science is immortalized. 1912.
Ask you.
Did I already? No, I already did this. This. Aha. Tell us about Alfred Wegener.
He believes in the continental drift.
Explain.
He says that once upon a time, all the cosigns met. They were all together in basically one giant puzzle piece. He's saying that it was true because his one explanation is the continental movement was caused by the centrifugal force of the Earth's rotation combined with changes in angular momentum.
Okay, talk to me in English.
He believed that since it was spinning around, it eventually broke apart.
As well, you have convection from underneath the Earth's crust, the magma, and these plates are floating on top of that magma.
But everyone was against it because they believed that there was no force strong enough to move large land masses.
What evidence did he use to suggest that continents had at one point been together?
I was that
Okay, so let's choose this one. This one shows it pretty well. If you look at the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa, potentially this is a place where these two used to fit together. This is further explained by looking at the rocks, the geology that's present in these continents and noting similarities between the geology here and here. At one point in time, it's theorized that India was not there. And as it moved, it collided with the Eurasian plate. And when it collided, so on the north side of India, you have a mountain range called the Himalayas. What's the tallest mountain?
Everest.
Mount Everest, which is in the Himalayas mountain range. So it's theorized that the driving together of the continents created such force that it drove the land upwards to create that mountain range. We see forms of life in Australia that are really, really unique. This fits into the last point of Charles Darwin's theory of reproduction isolation. It is theorized that Australia separated very early on from this mega-continent called Pangaea. And because they could not breed with other organisms, they only had a small population to breed with. And we have the development of very unique traits. Another piece of evidence that supports the idea that at one time the continents were in a different place is the north. We are having a lot of melting of the ice pack in the Arctic areas, which is revealing ancient tropical forests. Which suggests that the climate of that area at one point in time was very, very different than it is now. Is that because the climate was warm where it was, or were the continents in a different place? As we continue to study the genetics of these tropical forest remains and compare it to other extinct forms, we'll be able to track these changes better and see if one thing is actually related to another, or was this a totally unique microcosm? Alfred Wegener really helped to explain Alfred Wallace's ideas of distribution of animals throughout the world. But until we had his theory in 1912, Wallace really could not explain why animals were found where they were. He could not explain why there is an anteater form that's very similar in South America, Africa, and Australia. 3 very different species, all anteaters. Last, but definitely not least. Oh wait, should have 2 more. Okay, we're gonna do Dobzhansky first. Tell us about Dobzhansky. Do you want me to show the text? Okay, so just tell us. Don't read. What was this idea all about?
Well, he believed in like the natural selection also, and he also like the way he proved that he used fruit flies, and I don't know, it's just the way he researched it.
He defined evolution differently than the rest. Did you come across that definition? this person came up with the modern evolution synthesis theory. And he attempted to unite this idea of evolution with an upcoming new area in science called genetics. Do you remember from Science 9 what an allele is?
I know what it looks like.
For example, you all have a gene for eye color. Do you have the same gene for eye color? No. Some of you have brown eyes, some of you have blue eyes. That's an allele. So he said that change in the frequency of those alleles was what evolution was. So for example, if we started off with a population that had, let's say 85% of the population had brown eyes, and then all of a sudden in 10 years' time, only 10% of the population has brown eyes. He would define that as the population is evolving. For some reason, the brown-eyed gene people are not surviving. And so we're seeing that frequency of brown-eyed alleles being removed from the population for whatever reason. He didn't necessarily say that evolution resulted in new life forms. So he took evolution from being on an individual level to looking at evolution at a population level. And he really started this idea of population genetics. And to this day, when scientists or biologists study evolution, we study it at a group level. So for example, we track blood types. It used to be that a certain blood type would be more common in certain countries than in other countries. That is changing because people are moving and people are having children with other people from different places. So the blood types are being mixed up a lot. Does that mean in 10 years we'll see a common distribution of blood type no matter what country you go to? Could be. Don't know. It's one prediction. Then we get to Lynn. She's an interesting one. She's more recent. She did most of her work at the end of the Second World War, going into the Cold War. So this is a time period where there's very rapid technological advancement. She tried to come up with a theory of how the first life form came to be. At this point, all these ideas of natural selection and so forth are for species that already existed. And we didn't have a whole lot of theories about, well, what was the first life form? What did she say?
She created this theory of endosymbiotic theory.
And what does that mean?
That means that she found chloroplasts and mitochondrions to be merged together, and their DNA is formed inside of them.
And that became the nucleus. It's really interesting because people don't realize that we still actually have DNA in our mitochondria. We call it mitochondrial DNA. Have you heard that they are making fertilized eggs from 3 contributors?
I did hear about that. Yeah. It's like 3 different parents. All their DNA going into one.
Do you know how there's the human pigs are
But
You add
No,
another.
that's not.
You would add
but one of
another
those
gene.
contributions is actually a mitochondrial contribution, not an egg cell contribution.
Okay, so just like a little bit.
Oh my
Hmm
god, that's so not right.
Why?
Because it's not enough. You can just cheat on something.
It's just.
Like, what would,
But then,
what
like,
would be the benefits of that? Just like a more diverse immune system and stuff like that?
Because you could get all the negatives from this.
I'm not sure if what they thought was the advantage is the advantage.
You're an albino without hair. You're a tranny albino without hair.
I don't agree with that sweet parent thing. So a group of 3 people. Be like, hey.
How would it even work? How would it even work?
Let's get something that's a little bit under.
Egg out
And then 2 people. For what?
in a cup, and then they put it together. It's like in
And they
vitro.
just shake it up.
Yep. That's just like a shake it.
Put an egg in a cup and shake it up. Shake
and
it
then-
big.
Okay, so it is to treat some kind of genetic disorder.
Okay.
It's not. It is in my world.
I wouldn't call it 3-parent technology. This is about allowing families where they have disastrously ill, tragically ill children that die early in childhood or before their 20th birthday of organ failure, muscle, heart.
So I didn't expect to have sound.
yes.
I'm not sure why all of a sudden I matched sound. Let's see if I can get this to play.
I can do that too.
Of course, it's not going to work, right?
It's got 6 legs and stuff.
This is about allowing families where they have disastrously ill, tragically ill children that die early in childhood or before their 20th birthday of organ failure, muscle, heart, brain